Close to 200 countries have agreed to a legally binding global treaty to end plastic pollution. The UN Environment Assembly resolved to take on a draft, a treaty that will tackle not only plastic pollution in the oceans, but the full life cycle of plastics from production all the way to disposal. To talk more about this and South Africa's point of view, we're joined by Environmental Affairs Minister Barbara Creecy. Minister, a very good evening to you. Welcome to News at Prime. Let's begin with the extent of the plastic pollution crisis in South Africa specifically.
Good evening to you and greetings to all your viewers at home. Yes, South Africa produces about 4.5 million tons of plastic waste every year. The majority of this waste is committed to landfills. We do have a small plastic waste recycling operation in our country, and we do know that as a result of inadequate household waste collection in many areas of our country, some of this plastic waste leaks into the environment, goes into our water systems and ultimately finds its way into the sea. And this obviously poses a threat to marine life, ultimately to food security, and of course to the role of the ocean as one of the mechanisms that absorbs greenhouse gas emissions and mitigates against climate change.
Why do we need a separate treaty for plastic pollution when there's already a fair deal of global agreement on what to do as far as environmental care and protection in the decades ahead?
Well, I suppose it's because the situation with regard to plastic waste and particularly marine plastic litter is becoming of major concern globally. There are some studies that indicate that by 2050 there will be more plastic waste than fish in the oceans. And as I've already explained, this is obviously a threat to food security in many countries, not to mention the environmental damage. But I think the idea is to start to bring about a legally binding treaty that would have different aspects that would enable the international community to monitor itself and for us to monitor ourselves at a national level and ensure that we start to prevent this plastic from leaching into the environment.
And this treaty, if all goes according to plan, would take effect in 2024. That's in 2 years from now. What happens in the interim if the situation is as dire as you've just laid out?
Well, I think in the case of our own country, we are already bringing about a new regulatory environment. We have what we call extended producer responsibility schemes. These schemes are in the packaging sector, in lighting, in e-waste. And what it means is that everybody who's involved in packaging and in particular plastic production has to be part of the scheme, has to think about the life cycle of plastic, and has to be taking measures to ensure that we promote recycling. At a government level, we've introduced regulations to ensure that by 2027, 100% of the content of plastic bags must be made from recycled material. And we're also doing a lot more with municipalities and provincial governments to try and up the percentage of households that have regular waste removal and stop plastic from leaching into the environment in the first place.
And if the COP climate summits have taught us anything, is that any agreement on an issue of the environment, a global agreement, often takes a long time to bring all countries together, or it just doesn't happen at all. What do you foresee as the sticking points on the plastics issue?
Well, I think that obviously different countries have different national capabilities and are at different points in their development cycle. So we know that some of the big developed countries have already done a lot of research work on alternatives. They are already working with their industries on looking at the value chain and the life cycle. This is work that will be new for us. And just as in the case of the climate transition, if we're going to have a transition to reducing and eliminating single-use plastics from the value chain, there has to be a transition, there has to be involvement of industry, there has to be accessibility to technological know-how, to capability, and of course to financing. So I think that what we're learning in all these transitions is that different countries have different capabilities, and we have to take account of these in the negotiation process.
Do we have the money to do this and do it well?
Well, I think that the key issue is what will be the time frames for implementation. We're already working with our plastics industry. They have agreed in principle that this instrument is necessary. And of course, they would be very interested to access research and development money, which has been promised in some of our bilateral agreements, so that we can start to look at new products. There's already so-called compostable or biodegradable plastic. We have to make sure that if these products are introduced into our country, they adhere to international standards and that they are indeed biodegradable and are not creating microplastics, which, as we know, go into our water supply and so on.
How do we get the rich countries to pay more so that the developing nations can also be able to come forward and move ahead with this idea?
Well, that is always the challenge. I suppose that what we know is that some of our major plastic users and consumers in our retail and food sectors are part of international chains. They're already having to implement much stricter regulations elsewhere. And in meetings we've had with them, we've said to them that we expect them to adhere to these principles even in our environment. But of course, our industry would be looking to attract new investment and also to be attracting, as I said, research and development money so that we can have a transition that doesn't push workers out of work and doesn't undermine the industry that exists in this country while we are protecting the environment.
And at an everyday level, when many of us think about the elimination of plastics in day-to-day living, we think of the replacement of plastic straws with paper straws. Some have said globally that makes up a very little contribution to bringing down the number of plastic or the amount of plastic waste that is out there. How much of a difference has it made for us?
Well, we have, as I said, already started to work with our fast food value chains and our retail sectors, and I'm sure if you go and buy a product in one of the fast food chains, you will see that there is a change in the packaging, and in some instances you'll get cardboard or wooden products rather than plastic products. I think that we've got to go a lot further, but I also think that we've got to establish this concept of the circular economy. So instead of having a produce, consume, dispose culture, we've got to move towards a situation where we view current products as the raw material for future different products. And this is, of course, work that we are wanting to do with the industry so that we increase recycling and reuse of plastics and try and minimize the amount of plastics that are leaching into our environment.
Minister Barbara Creecy, good to speak to you. Thank you very much. Barbara Creecy is Minister for Forestry, Fisheries and Environmental Affairs.